Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Suranjali Seal, and if you are somebody who loves literature and is all about literature, then this is the channel for you. Now, in our video today, we are going to discuss the life and works of Edmund Spenser. Now, before I dive deep into the details of the life and works of this great literary genius, I would like to highlight a few facts. First of all, as students of literature, I'm sure that our teachers have always told us in our colleges and universities that before we study the works of a writer, it is very important to also know about the background. Now, why is the background so important for students of literature? It is because imagine if you are maintaining a journal and you fill it every day, then what will that journal contain? It will contain your experiences of the days in your life. So if you had a good day, then your journal, the contents of your journal will reflect that mood. And if you did not have such a good day and not so happy day, then the contents of your journal will reflect that mood. So whatever you fill into your journal will depend on your experiences of the day, the feelings that you had, and the mindset and sensibility which you have as a person. It also reflects your character. So therefore, when you know what you went through throughout the day, that's when you'll understand the point of the journal entry. So in the same sense, before we begin the works, the summary of the works of Edmund Spenser, it is important that we know some concrete facts and influences that influenced his life. Now, before I go on to explaining the life and works of Edmund Spenser, I would like to recommend you to go and check out another of my videos which dealt specifically with the age of Elizabeth. Now, the age of Elizabeth is the age to which Edmund Spenser belonged to in the history of English literature. So if you know the characteristics of the age, then it will be easier for you to have a general understanding of what the age was like, what the value systems were like, and what impacted Edmund Spenser's writings. And in this video, without further ado, we are going to go and explore the life and works of Edmund Spenser together. So let's get into it right away. Now let's begin with the first fact that we as students of literature need to know about Edmund Spenser, and that is the year that he was born and the place that he was born in. So he was born in the year 1552 in East Smithfield, which is the place, and his life can be divided into phases of three influences, that of Cambridge, London, and Ireland. So these are the three places in which Edmund Spenser lived out his life, and these are the places that go on to influence a lot of his writings, and these are distinct from one another. So we are going to look at each of these phases in subsequent as we progress through the video. Now let's first go into the first phase, that is the Cambridge phase of Edmund Spenser's life, which covers his education. So Edmund Spenser was educated in the Merchant Taylors' School, and after that he went on to study in Cambridge. And this period is particularly important for him because it is here that he read the classics and wrote numberless little poems. So for the first time he writes poems and he's inspired by the classics. He reads the great classical literature, and this again goes on to inspire a lot of his works in his life. So let's move on to the second phase now, which is the London phase of his life, and just one of the turning points in Edmund Spenser's life, and it is a really important one. So let's get into it. In the London phase of Edmund Spenser's life, we have to follow a chronology, okay? But before I go into this chronology and give you the facts, I would like to cite an example. Now, all of us are blessed with well-wishers and good friends in life, right? Now, you would know that if you have a good friend and when you achieve something and you share that achievement with your friend, then your friend would always encourage you to do better. So, for example, let's just take an example. If I write a poem and it's a good one and I show it to my friend, the well-wisher would always tell me that would start giving me advice. They would say, why don't you publish your work? Why don't you take up editing jobs? Why don't you publish your works or become a creative writer permanently? So these are the type of advice which a good friend would tell you by seeing your potential. Now in Edmund Spenser's case too, this is exactly what happened. He left Cambridge in 1576 and then he went to live in the north of England, and it is here that he had a friend named Harvey, and in all probability Harvey must have read his books and he was a good friend, so he advised Spenser that why don't you go to London? You can go to London, it's a big city, of course there are opportunities. So he advised Spenser to go to London, and it is on his advice that Spenser comes to London, and this is an important phase of his life because it is in London that he meets Leicester. Now, who is Leicester? He is a person who was at the time at the height of royal favor. Now, what do we mean by royal favor? I mean, in layman's term, it would definitely mean special treatment, okay? Now, who were granted royal favors? Anyone who contributed significantly to the English nation, its development, culture, religion, way of life, its security, whoever contributed in their capacity to the English nation, and if it is a significant contribution, then those people would be granted royal favors by Queen Elizabeth I. So Leicester was one such person who was at the height of royal favors. And why was this beneficial for Spenser? It is because he stayed with Leicester in Leicester House, and it is through him that he met eminent personalities. He met all of the Queen's favorites because he had connections, and through Leicester's influence, Edmund Spenser himself made connections. He also met Philip Sidney through Leicester's influence because Philip Sidney was also one of the Queen's favorites. Now, another reason why this period with Leicester is important, it is because as he was staying with Leicester in Leicester House, he finished the Shepherd's Calendar here. Now, the Shepherd's Calendar is one of the works of Edmund Spenser, which I will deal with in another video where I'll be dealing with the summaries of the works of Edmund Spenser. Here we are supposed to remember two facts about the Shepherd's Calendar, which is very, very important for from the point of view of examinations. So what are these 2 points? Why is the Shepherd's Calendar important here? It is because it is the first work of Edmund Spenser's to be published. Spenser's first work to be published is the Shepherd's Calendar, and it was published in the year 1579. And also Spenser dedicated the poem to Philip Sidney. Now, he met Sidney, they became friends, and now he dedicates the poem to Philip Sidney. So these are two facts that we need to remember as students of literature, and the summary and other facts regarding this particular book will be dealt with in another separate video, so there's no need to worry about that. Now, when it comes to Leicester, what are the pros and cons that we have discussed? The pros of having met Leicester is that he was able to make connections. So once you make connections, you can circulate your works better, right? People will be better acquainted with you. People will know your works, and you'll be able to have a name. So he was able to make connections, and because he had so much potential, and also because he met good people, he was influenced by a lot of ideas, and that all reflected in his work. Okay, what are the cons though? The cons, or the flip side of it, was that he was growing weary of his dependent position, and he was growing weary of the court life also. He was dependent on Leicester, right? Because Leicester was introducing him to other people. So what he wanted was an independence of his own, and that of course was not possible for a considerable amount of his life. So this is about the London phase of his life. Let's move on to the third phase of his life, which is in Ireland. Now we come to the next phase of Edmund Spenser's life, which is the Ireland phase, and it is one of the most creative and fruitful phases of Edmund Spenser's life. Now, first of all, we have to understand that under what circumstances did Edmund Spenser leave London and move to Ireland? And that is because Edmund Spenser is made deputy to Lord Grey, the Queen's deputy in Ireland. So it is because of this reason that he's been made deputy to Lord Grey that he moves to Ireland to stay there. Now, you might ask that under what circumstances did he get or acquire this position? You've guessed it again, he got this position because of the influence of Leicester. Leicester probably recommended him to Queen Elizabeth. This idea of recommendation, right, that an eminent person would recommend one person to an employer. So he would say that I recommend this person, he's a person capable and fit for the job, you should hire him. And therefore Edmund Spenser is hired, he is made deputy to Lord Grey, and then he moves to Ireland to stay there. Now, the next question that comes to our mind is, where does he stay after moving to Ireland? And after moving to Ireland, he is given a huge estate, the castle of Kilcoman in Munster. Munster is the place where he stays, and he stays in the castle of Kilcoman. Now, if you look at the picture, there's this portion of the castle which still stands today. Now, this castle was burnt down. It was attacked and burnt down as Spenser, his wife, and his children were inside the castle. Now, the facts relating to this tragedy, I will tell you as we move, as we progress through the video. But Spenser, his wife and children escaped. They managed to escape, but this castle was burned. Okay, it was attacked and burned, and this is all that remains of the castle today. Now, the third important point that we have to remember as students of literature is that it is here in Kilcoman Castle, as he was staying in Munster in Ireland, that he finished the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen. Now, he did not finish all the books, mind you. Remember that here he finished only 3 books. So the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen were finished here. And the last important point that we have to remember in this phase of his life is that it is here in Ireland that he actually met Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, Walter Raleigh is again another eminent writer who we will study in another separate video, but in this video, because we're dealing with the life and works of Edmund Spenser, we will study Walter Raleigh in relation to Edmund Spenser only. So Walter Raleigh, who was Walter Raleigh? Walter Raleigh was an English adventurer and one of the favorites of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, both Edmund Spenser and Walter Raleigh acquired estates and were notable undertakers of the Munster plantation in Ireland. Now, you would have guessed it by now that the colonization of Ireland had begun, colonialism had begun. So they set up plantations in the colonies, right? So Walter Raleigh and Edmund Spenser worked in the plantations. They were hired as undertakers, and in the Munster plantation, both of them worked. They had huge estates, they met each other, and they became friends. Now, there are 2 fun facts which I would like to add here regarding Walter Raleigh. He is remembered for introducing the essential potato and the addictive tobacco. So that is a fun fact for all of us to just digest and know. And let's move on with the works of Edmund Spenser, which I will be dealing with in this video in brief, but I will make separate video on the summary of the works. So let's get into it. Now let's have a look at one of the most celebrated works by Edmund Spenser, which is the Fairy Queen. Now, before we dive deep into the facts about the Fairy Queen, we have to know the plan of the Fairy Queen. What was the original plan for the Fairy Queen which Edmund Spenser had in mind? So the Fairy Queen was supposed to be written. It is a poem which was supposed to be written in 24 books. So the original plan was of 24 books, but he could only finish 6. The second fact that is important for us is the publication. There are 2 sets of publications which we need to remember. That is, remember I had told you just a while ago that in Ireland he finished the first 3 books of the Fairy Queen. Those are the 3 books that were published first, and this happened in 1590. So the first set of the 3 books of the Fairy Queen was published in 1590. Now, 6 years later, as time went by and he finished more 3 books, in addition, he added 3 more books to the Fairy Queen. As he completed them, 6 years later, in 1596, another version was published. But this time, it contained all the books together. That is, the 3 that were already published, plus the 3 that he had written. So the first publication contained only 3 books, and the second publication, 6 years later, in 1596, contained all the 6 books. Now, of course, we have to know, what did the 6 books celebrate? What do they talk about? So the first book celebrated holiness, the second temperance, the third book celebrated chastity, the fourth friendship, the fifth justice, and the sixth courtesy. Now, interestingly enough, there is also a 7th unfinished book, which is called the Cantos of Mutability. Now, remember just a while ago again, I had mentioned that Kilcoman Castle was set on fire, it was attacked. So it is believed, widely believed, that the remaining parts of the 7th book must have been lost in the fire. So all that remains with us today of the 7th unfinished book is the Cantos of Mutability. So these are the names of the books of the Fairy Queen which we have today, and they have a timeless element to them. We continue to read them in our curriculum and in our colleges today, and they seem to have held the tests of time, and they continue to inspire us till today. So let's look further into a few more details about the Fairy Queen, a few more facts which we need to remember. Now, there's something that we have to know about the Fairy Queen, and it is regarding Spenser and, of course, Walter Raleigh and their relationship in relation to the Fairy Queen. Now, what happens is Spenser and Sir Walter Raleigh, like we know, they had become good friends. They shared each other's poetry with each other. Now, Spenser had written a letter to Walter Raleigh explaining his motive and intention for the Fairy Queen. Now, let's look at that letter. Spenser wrote a letter to Raleigh which introduces the poem. To portrait in Arthur before he was king, the image of a brave knight perfected in the 12 private moral virtues as Aristotle had devised, which is the purpose of these first 12 books, which if I find to be well accepted, I may perhaps be encouraged to frame the other part of politic virtues in his person after that he came to be king. So what he's trying to say here is that he's explaining to Raleigh that his intention is to write the first 12 books before Arthur had become king. He would want to cover that about the virtues of Arthur. He would want to cover that in the first 12 books, and if he finds that these 12 books are well received by the audience, then he is going to write another 12 books, that is 24 books in total, remember. So another 12 books which would cover politic virtues, that is after Arthur becomes king, what are the virtues you need to have to become a good leader. So if there's a question that is asked that who was the person to whom Spenser had related the idea and the intention behind the Fairy Queen, it is Walter Raleigh, and it is Raleigh who had hurried Spenser to London. He listened to the Fairy Queen and took Spenser to London to get his works introduced to to produce his work in front of Queen Elizabeth I. Now let's look at the things that we need to remember about the Fairy Queen. The first thing is that we have to remember that the Fairy Queen is an allegory. Now, what is an allegory? It is a story, picture, play, etc. that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. Now, let's take an example from the Fairy Queen itself to actually understand what an allegory is. The first picture here is when the Red Cross knight is allured by Duessa into the House of Pride. Okay, so you can understand that the House of Pride would definitely symbolize something. In the second picture, the Red Cross knight is being attacked by Orgoglio, a monster. Now, what is the significance of these two episodes? Now, if we look at the Orgoglio episode, then what happens is we can see in the picture also that Orgoglio has a huge and a gigantic countenance, and the Red Cross knight is seen to be struggling to lift the sword. He's weak. Now, why is he weak? Here what happens, as he is sitting or lying by a stream with Duessa, he's attacked by this giant and he's too weak to fight back. Okay, the term Duessa, the lady with whom he's sitting with, the Red Cross knight, Duessa, doesn't it have a similar sound to duplicity? Doesn't it have a similar ring to a dual-faced or double-faced or falsehood? So Duessa literally is a personification of this abstract vice, which is falsehood, which is duplicity. So Red Cross knight, because he's in the company of duplicity, he's attacked by Orgoglio. Now, Orgoglio literally means pride. So Orgoglio is a personification of the vice, which is pride, and pride attacks the Red Cross knight. Now, in our day-to-day lives also, we always know that our elders and our loved ones always tell us that never be proud. Having pride is a vice. So the moment the day you're proud, your downfall begins on that day. You're not supposed to be self-absorbed and you're not supposed to be proud, right? It's a vice. So Orgoglio, when this vice attacks the Red Cross knight, when he's taken by vice, then he's unable to lift the sword. It weakens him. So you can understand the play of words here. The names and the plot line is not randomly chosen. All of them have a hidden meaning. So this is exactly what an allegory is, and we see this continuing, and we see this element throughout the Fairy Queen. Now, the second thing that we have to remember regarding the Fairy Queen is that it is all about vices versus virtues, all of which are personified. So we have to know, what do we mean by personification? Personification is attributing human qualities to non-living things or abstract qualities or ideas. So like I said, abstract quality and idea like vice, like a vice like pride is given human attributes in the figure of Orgoglio. Now we have to also know who influenced Edmund Spenser. Now Edmund Spenser did not want to rival Chaucer, nor did he want to surpass Chaucer. He genuinely revered Chaucer. He was influenced by Chaucer in his writings, and particularly for the Fairy Queen, he modeled the Fairy Queen or took his influence for the Fairy Queen from Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. So this is one of the facts that we have to remember, that the Fairy Queen is modeled upon Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, and Edmund Spenser was also influenced by Chaucer. Now finally, the final thing which we have to remember about the Fairy Queen is that it is in the Fairy Queen that for the first time Spenser he invents, and he also uses what we know as the Spenserian stanza. So these are the facts that we have to remember about the Fairy Queen. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's understand what do we mean by the Spenserian stanza. Now the Spenserian stanza is a 9-line stanza, 8 lines of 5 feet each, last line of 6 feet. Now this might sound very confusing when we read it at one go, so let's just try and understand it in parts. The Spenserian stanza is one of 9 lines. So the stanza is of 9 lines, there are total 9 lines, and each line of this stanza is 5 feet, is of 5 feet. So we have to understand what do we mean by feet, or what is a poetic foot. So a poetic foot is a unit of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry. Now, you know the words, I mean, those of you who would not know what we mean by poetic foot or a syllable, if you take a word, there is always a stressed and unstressed part. Say, for example, I take the word faithful. So you see there's a stress, faithful. That's the unstressed part. So this stressed and unstressed part, we call them the two parts, the dividing part, we call them syllables. There are two syllables in this word. Now in the Spenserian stanza, 8 lines, I mean, the first 8 lines have 5 feet. So 5 feet of stressed and unstressed syllables, that means 10. There'll be stressed and unstressed syllables, 5 feet. So that means there must be 10 parts to it, okay? And then the last line is of 6 feet. So if it's 6 of stressed and unstressed syllables, so that means we'll have 12. Now if it's still really confusing, and it is often confusing, then just let's count together, okay? I have one of the one of the lines from Fairy Queen, a few of the lines from Fairy Queen, and we can read that together and attempt to count this these feet, okay? Let's just decipher it together. Now let's take the first line. But on his breast a bloody cross he bore. That's 10. Now let's go to the next line. The dear remembrance of his dying Lord. So you see there are 10 syllables. 5 feet, so 10 syllables, 1 feet of stress. 1 foot of stressed and unstressed. That means that when we say remembrance, so there's remembrance, that divide is there, right? So you have to count it together. So you have the dear remembrance of his dying Lord. So the stressed and unstressed parts have to be divided accordingly. Okay, so let's move on. For whose sweet sake that glorious badge he wore, and dead as living ever him adored. Up on his shield the like was also scored, for sovereign hope which in his help he had. Right faithful, true he was in deed and word, but of his cheer did seem too solemn sad. Now the last line is of 6 foot. So what do we expect? It has to be of 12 syllables, right? So yet nothing did he dread, but ever was ye dread. Right? So there you go. So that's the Spenserian stanza. 8 lines of 5 feet each, and the last line of 6 feet. After the Fairy Queen is well received, after he gets critical acclaim from various writers and from Queen Elizabeth herself in London, he returns back to Ireland. And it is in Ireland that this time he falls in love with Elizabeth Boyle. Now, who was Elizabeth Boyle? She was an Irish girl who Spenser fell in love with, and it is in her honor that he wrote commendable works of literature which continue to inspire us till today. And what are these works that he had written in her honor? The first is Amoretti, or the Sonnets. Represented her in the Fairy Queen as the beautiful woman dancing in the graces, and he wrote the famous Epithalamion, a beautiful wedding hymn celebrating his marriage to her in 1594. So these are the works that he had written in the honor of Elizabeth Boyle, his wife. And it is very important to remember these facts from any examination points of view. Now, the next time that Spenser visits London again is on the death of his friend Sidney. Now, remember we had studied that it is through Leicester's influence that Edmund Spenser was able to acquaint himself with the Queen's favourite. Philip Sidney was one of the Queen's favourites, and they met and they became friends. And upon his death, after Philip Sidney's death, upon his death, Edmund Spenser he wrote and published Astrophel in 1595. Now, Astrophel is an elegy. It is an elegy which he wrote on the death of his friend Sidney. So what is an elegy? What do we mean by an elegy? It is a poem of serious reflection, typically a lament for the dead. So we have to remember this again from the examination points of view, that the elegy which he had written in honor of Philip Sidney on his death is Astrophel, 1595. Now, finally, we come to the final phase of Edmund Spenser's life, which is when he goes back to Ireland. After this, he again returned back to Ireland and he's appointed Sheriff of Cork. Now, what happens here is that this is the final phase of Edmund Spenser's life. The tragedy of Kilcolman Castle, where Edmund Spenser's castle was set on fire, it was attacked, and he barely escaped with his wife and children. This is the phase that it takes place in Ireland again. So let's look at the final phase of this literary genius, the life of this literary genius. Now, the Tyrone's rebellion had broken out soon after Edmund Spenser had gone back to Ireland, and the rebels attacked Kilcolman Castle. Kilcolman Castle was one of the first places that the rebels attacked, and it was set on fire. And let's look at some of the facts of the Tyrone's rebellion. It broke out in Munster. It lasted for 9 years, 1593 to 1603. It was Kilcolman Castle was the first places to be attacked. Spenser barely escaped with his wife and 2 children. He seems to have never recovered from the shock. He died the following year in 1599 in an inn at Westminster. He was buried beside his master Chaucer in Westminster Abbey. So this is the life and works of Edmund Spenser. His achievement is highlighted by the fact that he's buried beside his master, and also one of the greatest figures in the history of English literature, that is Chaucer himself. And let's just do a recap of whatever we have studied in this video, and just let's wind up whatever we have gathered, whatever information we have gathered through this video together. So kindly recap with me all about Edmund Spenser. Born in 1552, life and works divided into 3 parts: Cambridge, London and Ireland, influenced by Chaucer and Ariosto. First published work, The Shepherd's Calendar in 1599 or 1580. Most celebrated work, The Fairy Queen, 1590, then 1596. Other works, The View of the State of Ireland, Amoretti or Sonnets, Astrophel, Epithalamion. Contribution, The Spenserian Stanza. Critical acclaim, called The Poet's Poet by Charles Lamb. Charles Lamb is another writer which we will study in a separate video, but he's one person who has called Spenser the Poet's Poet. So this is the critical acclaim that he had received. So if this video has been informational and helpful to you in any way, then do like the video and share the video, and do subscribe to my channel for similar content. Until we meet again, love all things literature and more power to you. Thank you.